sorting through my mother-in-law's medical bills when my brother called to tell me he'd already sold her house. Not that he was thinking about selling it, not that he wanted to discuss it. He'd already done it, closed 2 weeks prior, and he was calling me now, in that careful, rehearsed voice he uses when he knows he's wrong but has already decided not to care, to let me know that my share of the proceeds, my mother-in-law's home of 31 years, the house where my husband grew up, where we'd spent every Thanksgiving since we got married, was going to be handled internally. I remember the exact moment. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of papers from Mercy General, my reading glasses on, a cup of tea that had gone completely cold beside me. My mother-in-law had been in that hospital for 19 days at that point. Pneumonia that turned complicated. She was 68 years old and the doctors were cautiously optimistic, which is medical language for we don't really know yet. I said, "What do you mean sold?" He said, the market was right. It made sense to move. That was it. That was his entire explanation. My brother-in-law. I'll call him that because that's what he was to me for 11 years. The older brother my husband always tried to please. The one who sat at the head of the table at family dinners, even though it wasn't his table, had sold his mother's house while she was lying in a hospital bed, without telling her, without telling us, and he was calling me to deliver the news like it was an update about the weather. I put the phone down on the table, not hung up, just set it there, and I looked at the stack of medical bills and I thought, he's gonna need money soon. He's gonna come asking. I wasn't wrong. I just didn't know how soon. My husband and I have been together since we were 23. We met in a graduate program we both ultimately left. Him for construction management, me for hospital administration, which is a fancy title for the person who makes sure the finances of a healthcare facility don't collapse. I'm good with numbers. I'm good at reading documents. I know when something has been structured carefully and when something has been structured to hide. My mother-in-law. I'll call her what she asked me to call her, which was simply Mom. Because she said having 2 daughters-in-law who called her by her first name made her feel like a stranger at her own Thanksgiving table, is the kind of woman who kept every piece of paper she ever signed. Her filing cabinet was color-coded. Her will was updated every 3 years. She was not a woman who left things vague. My brother-in-law's wife, on the other hand, is the kind of person who treats any situation she didn't create as a personal inconvenience. She once complained at length at a birthday dinner that Mom had chosen a restaurant that was not really their vibe. Mom had picked it because it was her birthday. That is the level of person we're dealing with. They have been married 9 years. In those 9 years, they have moved 4 times, always into somewhere bigger, always with some explanation about equity and investment and opportunity. My husband and I have a modest house we've owned for 6 years. We have savings. We don't talk about it much because that's not something we do. But the reason we have savings is that I track every dollar and I don't pretend money is abstract. When Mom got sick, it was my husband who drove her to the ER. It was me who navigated the insurance paperwork, who called the specialist's office 11 times until someone called back, who sat with her on a Tuesday afternoon when my husband had to work and my brother-in-law was, apparently, closing on a real estate transaction. I found out about the house sale before my husband did. I made a choice not to tell him immediately. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I needed to understand what we were actually dealing with before he walked into a confrontation without the full picture. My husband loves his brother. That love has cost him a lot over the years, and I have watched it, and I have never once said I told you so, even when I could have. I called my mother-in-law's attorney instead. Her name is a woman I'd met twice, once at the will signing and once at a family dinner. Mom had invited her to because Mom treated her lawyer like a friend, which I respected. She picked up on the second ring, and when I explained what my brother-in-law had told me, there was a pause on the line that told me everything. He shouldn't have been able to do that, she said. But he did. He had a power of attorney, she said slowly, that was granted last year when your mother-in-law had that minor procedure. It was intended to be temporary. She may not have realized it was still active. I asked what that meant for the proceeds. Another pause. That's what we need to find out. Here is what I learned over the next 72 hours. Through a combination of the attorney's research, a title company my husband reached out to, and one very uncomfortable phone call with my brother-in-law's wife that she clearly didn't realize was as informative as it was. The house had sold for $412,000. My brother-in-law had used an active power of attorney that Mom had signed for a routine knee surgery 14 months earlier. The document had not been revoked. He had found a buyer through someone he knew, used a discount broker, and closed quickly enough that no one in the family had time to ask questions. The proceeds had been deposited into an account in his name. Mom did not know. She was in a hospital bed, worried about her oxygen levels and whether her potassium was still low, and her son had sold her home and she did not know. I sat with that for a long time before I decided what to do next. My husband, when I finally told him, and I told him the night I confirmed the numbers, when I knew I had something solid to show him rather than a phone call I couldn't prove, went very quiet. That's how he gets when something is too big for his immediate reaction. He went quiet, and he looked at the table, and then he said, "We have to tell her." I know. She can't find out from him. I know. What do we do? That was the question. That was the thing I'd been turning over for 3 days. Because the situation was this, my brother-in-law had technically used a legal instrument. Whether he'd used it appropriately, whether it constituted a breach of his fiduciary duty as her agent, whether it could be challenged, those were legal questions. But the money was already moved. The house was already sold. And Mom was in a hospital, and we were going to have to tell her. What I did first was not dramatic. It was paperwork. I am very good at paperwork. I contacted the attorney and asked her to file a formal review of the power of attorney usage. I asked her what documentation we would need. I spent an evening organizing every email, every text, every piece of financial correspondence I could access. I created a folder. I labeled it clearly. And then I did one other thing. Mom had a small investment account. Not large, not life-changing, but money she'd set aside over decades. A little from a settlement in her 40s, a little from an inheritance from her own mother, a little from careful saving. She had added my husband to that account as a secondary holder 2 years prior, during a conversation about estate planning that she'd had with both of us. Not with my brother-in-law, because by that point she trusted my husband with her finances in a way she didn't entirely trust her older son, though she would never have said so out loud. I asked my husband to move that money. Not to hide it, not to take it, to transfer it to a separate account in his name alone, so that if his brother had any plans that extended beyond the house, those plans would fail. My husband looked at me for a long moment. You think he was going to go after that too? I think, I said, that he sold the house in 2 weeks while his mother was hospitalized. I think we should not give him the opportunity to do anything else. He moved the money that afternoon. 2 weeks later, my mother-in-law came home from the hospital, not to her house because her house was gone, but to ours because we had a guest room and because there was nowhere else sensible for her to go while we figured out the next steps. She walked in carrying a small bag and she looked around our living room and said, with the kind of dignity that takes a lifetime to build, "Well, this is nice. You have good light in here." We told her that evening. We sat at the kitchen table, the three of us, and my husband told her about the house, and about the power of attorney, and about the account his brother had deposited the money into. He was calm. He was honest. He didn't minimize it, and he didn't catastrophize it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "How long have you known?" He told her 3 weeks. She looked at me. "And you?" 3.5 weeks, I said. She nodded slowly. "You were gathering information first." "Yes." She nodded again. She looked out the window at our backyard, which is just a yard, nothing special, some grass and a bird feeder my husband put up 3 summers ago. Then she said, "I need to make some calls tomorrow." She fired her attorney and hired a new one. She revoked the power of attorney, formally and in writing. She contacted the title company directly, and she contacted the account where the money was sitting. And she began a process that I will not detail entirely here because it is still ongoing. But the short version is, my brother-in-law's access to that money is now the subject of a legal dispute that he did not anticipate when he moved quickly enough to avoid questions. He called my husband about 2 weeks into that process. I wasn't in the room, but I heard my husband's side of the conversation from the kitchen, where I was making dinner and not at all pretending I wasn't listening. "She knows," my husband said, and then a pause. "No, we told her." Another pause, longer. "That's not." "No. You don't get to be angry about this." A very long pause. "I'm not going to do that." And then, very quietly, "You sold her house while she was in the hospital. What exactly did you think was going to happen?" He hung up. He came into the kitchen and stood there for a moment looking at me, And then he picked up a piece of the bread I'd just sliced and ate it standing up. And I didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and we had dinner. My brother-in-law's wife called me the following week. This surprised me because she and I have never had what I would describe as a warm relationship. We are polite to each other. We sit at the same tables. We pass the same dishes. But she has always treated me with the faint condescension that some people extend to anyone they've decided is not quite their level. And I have always been unbothered by it because I know what my level is. She called and said that they were going through a difficult moment and that family needed to come together. I said, I agree. I think the most important thing is that mom is supported. She said that they were also under a lot of pressure, that the market hadn't behaved the way they'd expected, that some things hadn't worked out as planned. I waited. She said that they might need some help, bridging some expenses just temporarily, and that she thought, given the circumstances, given how close we all were as a family. I said, I'm going to stop you there. She stopped. I said, I understand that you're in a difficult position, but you're asking me while my mother-in-law is sleeping in my guest room because she doesn't have a home to help bridge your expenses. I don't think I need to explain why that's not something I'm going to do. She said that was very disappointing. I said I was sorry she felt that way. She hung up. I went back to the spreadsheet I've been working on. I have a lot of spreadsheets these days. The thing about living with someone you love, really living with them, in the daily, mundane, small detail way, is that you learn who they are in moments that have nothing to do with drama. My mother-in-law drinks her coffee black and very hot. She reads actual physical books, and she dog-ears the pages, which she knows I find mildly horrifying, and which she does a little bit on purpose. She watches the early morning news with the sound low, the way people do when they've lived alone long enough to consider silence a courtesy. She is, in ways I didn't fully understand before she came to live with us, a very private person who has spent her life trying not to be a burden to anyone, which makes what her older son did to her. The specific betrayal of it, the way he turned her trust into a transaction while she was too sick to notice, not just wrong but cruel in a particular way. She told me once, about 6 weeks after she came to stay with us, that she had known for years that something was off, that he had always treated her less like a mother and more like a resource, that she had tried for decades to convince herself it was just his way, that he showed love differently, that she must be misreading it. You weren't misreading it, I said. She looked at me for a moment and then looked away. No, she said. I don't think I was. She is rebuilding. That's the honest word for it. The legal process is slow and she doesn't talk about it much. But she is rebuilding. She is connected with a financial counselor to think through what the next chapter looks like. She has made peace, I think, with the version of her son that actually exists, rather than the one she hoped would eventually emerge. She is 68 years old, and she came through pneumonia and a betrayal that would have leveled most people, and she still gets up every morning and makes her coffee black and very hot and reads a few pages before the day starts. I think about the version of this story where I didn't make those calls, where I waited, where I gave my brother-in-law the benefit of the doubt, the way my husband wanted to in those first stunned days, where the investment account was still sitting there, accessible, when he eventually reached for it. And I believe, based on everything I know about him, that he would have reached for it. I think about my mother-in-law finding out after the fact, when everything was already gone, when there was nothing left to fight for. I'm good at a lot of things, but the thing I am best at is reading a situation clearly before emotion makes it blurry. My husband is the person who will always see the best in someone until he can't anymore. That's something I love about him, but someone has to be paying attention to what's actually happening. And in this family, that has always been me. Well, my brother-in-law called again, about 3 months later. It wasn't to apologize. It was to ask if my husband could speak to his mother on his behalf, to explain, to soften things. I handed the phone to my husband and walked out of the room because I knew I would not be able to stay quiet, and staying quiet was the better strategic choice. My husband said, "She knows what happened. I'm not going to ask her to pretend she doesn't. That's not something I'll do." And then, after a pause, "I hope you get there eventually. I really do. But I can't make this easier for you." He hung up. He found me in the kitchen. He sat down across from me. He said, "I keep thinking about how many times I defended him." "I know. And you never said anything." "It wasn't my place." He was quiet for a moment. I'm glad you made those calls. I know, I said. I know you are. My mother-in-law bought a small condo last spring. Single floor, south-facing windows, good light. She sent me a photo before she sent one to my husband, which I think was her way of saying something she doesn't put into words easily. The caption said, "Look at this light." I have that photo saved in 2 places. We don't talk about my brother-in-law much anymore. He exists in the peripheral way that people exist when they have removed themselves from your life through their own choices and then are surprised to find themselves at the edges. He sends holiday texts. My husband responds with something brief and neutral. Mom does not respond at all. There is a version of this story that ends with reconciliation, with accountability and growth, and a family dinner where everyone is wiser and more careful, and there's some redemptive moment over a shared meal. I have watched enough television to know that version. I don't think it's ours. What I think is ours is this: a woman I love sitting in a condo with good light, reading a book with dog-eared pages. A husband who is learning, slowly, that loving someone does not require making excuses for them. A guest room that is empty now but doesn't feel empty, because something happened there that mattered. And me, still at the kitchen table, still reading documents, still making sure I understand exactly what's in front of me before anyone else has the chance to make it worse. I am very good at that. I still think about that stack of medical bills on my kitchen table, the tea gone cold, the reading glasses I've forgotten I was wearing, that specific Tuesday afternoon quality of light coming through the window, ordinary and unremarkable, right up until the moment it wasn't. What strikes me now, looking back, is how clearly everything had been leading to that phone call for years. Not in some mysterious, fatalistic way, just in the plain, observable way that patterns accumulate. My brother-in-law had always treated Mom like a balance sheet. He had always moved quickly and explained slowly if he explained at all. He had always been the kind of person who interprets someone else's trust as an opening. None of what he did was a surprise, exactly. It was just the moment the pattern became impossible to ignore. I think about the choices I made in those first 72 hours a lot. Calling the attorney before telling my husband. Sitting with the information long enough to understand it before letting emotion move faster than the facts. Moving the investment account. Those weren't dramatic decisions in the moment. They were quiet ones. They were the kind of decisions that don't feel significant until later, when you can see what would have happened if you'd made the other choice. Here's what I've come to believe. Doing the right thing rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with clarity and fanfare. It arrives looking like a phone call you're not sure you should make, a document you should probably read more carefully, a feeling that something is off that you could very easily talk yourself out of paying attention to. The integrity of a moment is almost always invisible while you're in it. You only see it clearly from the other side. And that's where the hard part lives. Not in the big confrontations, not in the dramatic phone calls, but in the patience it takes to stay clear-headed when everything in you wants to react. My husband is a good man. He loves with his whole chest, but love without discernment is just exposure, and someone has to hold the line between those two things. I have always been that person in our family, not because I'm better, but because I notice differently. I read the room at the level of documentation. What I want anyone who recognizes this story to understand is that protecting the people you love is not a passive act. It is not enough to mean well. You have to pay attention, build the knowledge to act, and then actually act, even when it's uncomfortable, even when the person you're protecting hasn't asked for help yet, even when the easier thing would be to wait and see. Mom is in her condo now, good southern light, dog-eared books. She rebuilt from a genuinely terrible thing. Not because circumstances got easier, but because she had the steadiness to face what happened clearly and keep moving anyway. That kind of resilience isn't dramatic either. It's just one morning after another, choosing to keep going. I am still at my kitchen table, still reading documents, still making sure I understand exactly what's in front of me. I've decided that's enough. That's actually quite a lot.